Chapter 27 of Sisters, Part 1. Twilight had almost forgotten what darkness looked like. She still remembered the pitch-black shadows of Kennerlot, yes. She remembered braving the graveyard of sunken ships in the Everfree, or exploring the bloodied remains of her old treehouse, her world lit only by the pale lamps of her dive suit, or the steady glowing of her own magic. She remembered what it meant to not know what was a mere 2 steps forwards, to have to keep pushing on while monstrous things chittered in the distance unseen. But darkness had taken on a new meaning after her time in Kennerlot. With her mutated eyes, she could see clearly even on the seafloor, far beyond the reach of the sun. Where previously darkness had been a thing of mystery, a thing that swallowed up the world and spat it back out only in reluctant bits and pieces, now darkness felt like a sad old friend. It had been her constant companion during her journey north, wrapping the world in a blanket of ashen grayscale, and she had grown used to being able to see clearly no matter where she was, never having to fill in the shadows with her own imagination. And so, when the black crystal had locked shut behind her, sealing her within the spire, it came as a shock when she found herself swathed in that old darkness once again. She couldn't see a thing.
The shadows are more than shadows in this place.
Midnight's bloodshot eyes floated in front of her, looking around curiously.
We should be cautious.
Twilight gulped and lit her horn. A wall of smooth crystal curved away from her on her right side, a neatly cut stairway winding around it under hoof. But there was only empty air on her left. The air was still and stale, as if she were inside, yet no matter how much power she pushed into her horn, her light never illuminated any far wall.
That wasn't a mundane doorway.
She leaned over the edge, twisting her magic into the familiar shape of her pink spell and sending it questing down into the depths. It returned garbled and messy after a far too long wait.
We're not in the spire anymore. Or perhaps the spire is more than it seems,
Midnight suggested.
We should move as quickly as we can.
Twilight nodded, pushing herself into motion. The seconds stretched on into minutes, and as the minutes added up, she would sometimes pause to peer over the edge, shining an arcane spotlight down into the shadows, and frowning when no end came in sight. Midnight walked through the air beside her, a barely visible silhouette with a pair of bloodshot purple eyes, making no attempt to hide her mounting impatience. Twilight didn't mind the walk. The dead, almost smothering silence, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of her hooves on the crystal, gave her plenty of space to think. How many ponies had made this descent before her? And where did they go when they reached the bottom? Logic dictated that they either moved on to some other, further destination, or that they spent the rest of their lives within these crystal walls. Would she find some isolated community of chosen living in servitude to a being they believed to be a god? Old bodies piled up in dark corners with only the trappings of their lost lives to hint at their fates? Or worse, the thought was enough to make her stomach twist with anxiety. More empty ruins. A dead end to reward her for her long journey north. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since she started her descent, but she let out a sigh of relief when she finally reached the bottom. The crystal was cold under hoof, and she stepped off the stairs, casting her light around. The empty, shadowed void stretched on in all directions, with the sheer column that the stairs wrapped around as the only landmark. She walked around it slowly, searching for some hint as to where to go next, until her light fell on a plain door of black wood set into the crystal. A small gem was embedded on top of its arch, its inky surface absorbing her light.
There is magic on this door.
Midnight stepped forwards, narrowing her eyes.
Magic of my nature. Do you think it's safe to open?
Midnight scoffed.
Does it matter? We will not turn back now, and we will face the threat of the door together.
Her horn glowed, and a red-tinted beam of lavender magic struck the gem on top of the door. The gem glowed in response, dark purple smoke curling from behind it as the magic traveled down and outlined the door with its glow. A second later, the door flew open with a violent rattle, revealing a blinding light within. Twilight moved to enter, but Midnight stepped in front of her.
I shall be first.
She paused, waiting for some protest, but Twilight only nodded in response. Midnight turned to the door, horn glowing and ready for any threats that might wait on the other side, and walked confidently forward. Twilight blinked. The dark void, the crystal pillar, and the glowing door had vanished. She found herself instead on a flat plain of wind-swept ice, swirling clouds of snow drifting past in the howling wind's wake. Midnight stood opposite her, kneeling with her jaw clenched in obvious pain, and her eyes narrowed in distress.
What?
Twilight looked around in confusion, seeing her friends standing to either side. They were arranged in a circle with Midnight between them, their eyes hard and their ears back as they glared at the creature between them. The elements of harmony glowed against their chests, and with a quiet gasp, Twilight realized that the element of magic was perched on her brow, the tiara teeming with energy.
This is it, Midnight!
Rainbow snarled, scratching a hoof against the ice.
You're going down! And good riddance!
Rarity tossed her mane as the gems began to glow brighter, rainbow light arcing between them to form a pulsing ring around Midnight.
Fools!
Midnight spat back.
All I've ever done was try to protect you! To protect Twilight!
No pony responded, instead closing their eyes as the hum of the elements grew louder. Their hooves drifted off the ice as the magic coursed through their bodies, lifting them into the air and glowing almost blindingly bright.
You never understood us!
Midnight's voice broke as she collapsed against the ice, red tears building in her eyes. Her jaw quivered and her lips trembled, and the next time she spoke, her imperious condescension was gone. In its place was a desperate, hoarse anguish, blood dripping down her cheeks and splattering on the ice below.
I was just trying to help! I saved her! I saved you!
Twilight's gut churned. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? This was what she had hoped for when she'd first found the elements. A way to make things how they used to be, to eject the evil invader that had taken root in her mind and take her body back.
Please! I beg you!
Midnight turned a slow circle, gazing up at the impassive silhouette surrounding her. At last, her eyes settled on Twilight's, wide and fearful.
Please! We understand each other! Don't let them do this to me!
Twilight froze, held in place by the sight of her own blood-stained face twisted in despair. This wasn't right. As much as she had wanted nothing more than to be rid of Midnight in the past, things were different now. Midnight had never asked for any of this. She had made the wrong decisions for the right reasons, and she was already learning to see the world as more than just a collection of adversaries to destroy. Further, Midnight was her own pony. Even if she had forcefully inhabited a part of Twilight's mind and tried to take over their body in a misguided attempt to protect their friends, she deserved to live as much as anyone did. But most important of all, Midnight was her friend. 6 rainbow beams shot out of the elements, converging above Midnight's head like a spear about to drop. She looked up, the rainbow colors reflected in her slitted eyes, and let out a terrified scream.
Stop!
Twilight's hooves flew up to the element of magic, ripping it away. The rainbow magic fizzled with a sputtering crackle as the tiara struck the ice and shattered to pieces. But Twilight paid it no mind. She barely noticed as the silhouettes of her friends blew away in the wind, like scraps of paper as she fell back to the ice. She ran forward and pulled Midnight into her hooves, cutting off her sobs with a tight, comforting hug. They were back in the dark void an instant later, holding each other in front of the open door. The only sound was Midnight's rapid breathing.
It wasn't real.
Twilight stroked a hoof through Midnight's raggedy mane, squeezing her tight.
It was an illusion. I would never do that to you. What?
Midnight went suddenly stiff, her breaths cutting off with a sharp gasp. She didn't say anything for several seconds, but Twilight didn't let her go.
It's okay. Don't be afraid.
Twilight expected Midnight to pull away, to quickly assert that she had never been afraid of anything. But the other mare remained silent and still.
It's the door, I think.
She lifted her head to try and catch Midnight's eye. Midnight kept her head down, ears drooping. Finally, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes.
Why did you stop it?
Twilight frowned.
Huh? It's what you always wanted, isn't it? To destroy me? To be like you used to be?
Midnight shuddered, but didn't pull away.
So why didn't you let it happen? Because you're my friend.
Twilight gently guided Midnight's eyes up to her own.
Even if we have our disagreements, I know your heart is in the right place. You would do anything to protect me or my friends. And...
She paused, putting as much confidence in her voice as she could.
And I would do anything to protect you, too.
They shared a moment in silence, and Twilight offered up a tentative smile. Slowly, Midnight's breathing steadied, and Twilight's smile strengthened as she felt her other half's fear and panic fade away.
Twilight!
Twilight leapt back as Rainbow Dash careened out of the sky, crashing into the featureless ground beside her. She was beaten and bloodied, her eye patch torn away to reveal the ugly gash of her old wound, and she groaned as she tried and failed to climb to her hooves.
Rainbow?
Twilight rushed to her friend's side, rolling her onto her back.
How did you get here? What happened? Monsters.
Rainbow's voice was weak, forcing Twilight to lean in to hear her.
The crystal ponies, they turned on us.
More groans sounded behind her. A chill ran down Twilight's spine as she turned to see all her friends stumble down the steps, each one covered in weeping wounds worse than the last. Pinkie was sprawled out immobile on Applejack's back, and Fluttershy was quietly sobbing as Rarity helped support her weight. All 4 of them slumped down next to Rainbow, and Twilight's nose scrunched up at the scent of blood. Fluttershy moaned as she laid on her side, gasping in quick, pained breaths.
Save us, Twilight! They're coming!
Twilight grimaced, gaze darting from one friend to the next. Each of them looked to be on death's door, and she didn't know how to help them.
Who's coming?
A deep, Overlapping growling filled the air, seemingly coming from every direction. Twilight's breath caught as she looked up, spotting the ring of crystal ponies that had appeared from the shadows all around the crystal pillar. Their faces were streaked red with blood, and their bodies weighed down by thick hides and bone. Skulls impaled on spears swayed over their backs as they began to advance, chanting in a deep, guttural chorus that grew louder and more fervent with every step. And as Twilight stood to put herself protectively in front of her friends, a mist of dark purple magic began to rise from the crystal pony's eyes, stinging at her nose with the acrid stench.
Stay back!
Twilight poured power into her horn, but the spell fizzled out with a pitiful smirk, smothered by some unseen force. She grimaced as she tried again, to no avail.
I'm warning you!
You can do it,
Twilight's ears flattened as Applejack's exhausted voice cut through the chanting.
I know you can do it. You can save us.
No. Please, Twilight.
Rarity moaned, eerily quiet.
We need you to save us. I can't!
Tears welled in Twilight's eyes, blurring her vision red.
Please leave us alone! Please! I'll do anything! Why are you just standing there?
Rainbow asked.
We need you to stop them!
Twilight's legs buckled as the crystal ponies came closer, blood drooling past their teeth.
I can't. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do! There is.
Midnight appeared in front of her, her horn glowing with power. She reached a hoof out with a reassuring smile.
Together. Nothing can stop us.
Twilight blinked, and the chanting was gone. Not even a fading echo in its place. She looked around with a confused sob, but her friends had vanished. It was just her and Midnight again, alone in the smothering silence of the dark void.
It seems the door has revealed your fear as well.
Midnight pulled Twilight to her hooves, holding her gaze. She pursed her lips, and Twilight reflexively braced herself for some jab about her being weak or fearful or something like that.
But I'm here to guard you from it, as you did for me.
Midnight smiled. It was a warm, comforting expression. Something that looked almost surreal on a face marred by bloody fangs and slitted eyes. It almost made Twilight want to laugh. But instead, she smiled back, forcing her pounding heart to slow. Twilight sniffled, wiping her tears away.
I'm glad you're here. Yes. Well.
Midnight pulled her hoof back gingerly, nodding towards the door.
It seems the path is open.
Twilight smirked at her friend's discomfort, but took the hint. The enchanted door hung open before them, the blinding white light replaced with a shadowed doorway.
Let's see what's on the other side.
Stepping over the threshold, Twilight cast her light around. She was in a smooth, cylindrical room of crystal. A chipped and irregular stairway wound up the wall, disappearing into the shadows above.
Great. More stairs.
She sighed, starting gingerly for the first step.
Wait.
She froze with one hoof in the air.
What is it? There's something coming.
A long, sibilant hissing echoed off the walls above, bouncing back and overlapping on itself as it grew steadily louder. Twilight's ears flattened as she backed against the wall, looking up towards the source of the sound and trying to imagine what kind of dark creature best be making it. But no matter how much she looked or how much power she poured into her light, all was still above her. The sound grew louder still, taking on new dimensions as it suddenly seemed to come from every direction. A deep bass rattled the air, almost like some great beast breathing out from the top of the stairs. Twilight realized she could make out words. "Another pony chosen to our service," it said. The voice was masculine and deep, rolling over her like thunder. "Come, servant. Fulfill your purpose." Twilight froze, waiting for the rumbling bass of the voice to pass. Soon the stairwell was silent once more, leaving only the tingling hairs on the back of her neck in the voice's wake. She looked to Midnight, eyes wide.
What was that? The thing we felt when we first entered this city,
she said.
Something like me.
Rarity had never seen Leviathan Wakes before. She remembered Twilight's description of the floating city, of a sprawling mesh of boats and rafts all lashed together by rope and chain, 100 crews hauled across the waves by ancient sea creatures known only as the Leviathans. It had sounded majestic and breathtaking, like something out of a storybook, a vagrant city populated by dashing rogues and handsome villains. But Rarity found such imaginings more silly than appealing of late. No doubt it was a city like any other in the new Equestria, filled with ponies all out for themselves. It was difficult to tell from above. The sun had dipped below the horizon as their ship approached, and the clouds blocked much of what little light would have been supplied by star or moon. So when Rarity leaned over the railing to get her first impression of Leviathan Wakes, she did not find her breath stolen away by some fantastical vista. At first, she thought there had been some kind of mistake. Even a Barrenland village had its own soft glow at night, cast out by candles and hearths burning behind closed shutters. But Leviathan Wakes was eerily dark, with only a few spots of light bobbing on the waves below, where there no doubt should have been hundreds. The clouds parted briefly overhead, the starlight giving Rarity a quick glimpse of ship homes left broken and abandoned in the dark, their hulls smashed, and their chipped masts dipping into the water like oars, as if to try and pedal for safety. The illumination lasted only for a moment, and as the clouds once again closed up and swathed most of the city in darkness, Rarity couldn't help but draw her cloak closer about her shoulders. If what the marooned air ponies had told her was true, then Leviathan Wakes was well on its way to becoming a ghost town. Lady Rarity? Rarity jumped, glancing back to see Whitehorn approaching with a grim frown.
Ah, Whitehorn.
He dipped into a quick bow. The captain is bringing us in now. She's not very happy with you, you know.
Yes, I had gathered as much.
Rarity pursed her lips, looking back down to the city.
Is it always like this?
No. Here, take this. Rarity arched a brow as he pulled a strange yellow tube out of his vest, about half the length of his forehead and thin enough to fit comfortably in his hoof. A little square base stuck out of one end, though it looked too small for the thing to stand upright on its own.
What is it?
A flare launcher. You strike the base against the ground, like so, and it'll shoot a bright light out of the other end. We'll see it, and then we'll know to come get you.
We?
Rarity frowned, looking up to meet his eyes.
Do you not intend to accompany me?
My lady, the captain was about at her limit, the moment you forced her to stop and aid that marooned ship," Whitehorn said. "And now you have her landing here in the dark with rumors of monsters infesting the place. I applaud your ability to finding and applying leverage to get what you want, but there's no telling when she'll decide she'd rather risk your punishment than your service." He sat down, slipping the flare launcher into the satchel hanging at Rarity's side and giving it a reassuring pat. "To be frank, Countess, I expect she would chart a path for Harvest the instant we stepped off her ship and never looked back. And then we'd be just as trapped as everyone else in this city. One of us must stay here to ensure she doesn't abandon us."
One of us,
Rarity snorted.
And so you decided it should be yourself?
He met her gaze with a wry grin. "Rarity, I may not have known you for long, but I know you would sooner jump off the ship and swim into the city than be trapped aboard while others get their hooves dirty." A moment passed as Rarity narrowed her eyes, feigning suspicion, but he saw right through her. At last she gave in, rolling her eyes with a small smirk.
Yes, I suppose you're right. I was wondering why you hadn't tried convincing me against all this.
He smiled back before breaking eye contact, looking down to the city approaching below. "You certainly wouldn't listen if Celestia herself gave the order." The metal clatter of a hatch opening behind her caught Rarity's ear, and her smile widened as she saw Pinkie Pie climb up onto the deck, grunting with the effort of dragging her wheels up the steep stairs.
Pinkie, ready to go?
Pinkie nodded, but did not return the smile. Her lips were set into an uncharacteristically focused line, and her bags were stuffed to the brim. A cupcake slipped out of one as she stepped closer, its bright frosting splattering against the tarnished metal of the deck with a sad plop.
I'm ready,
she said, her voice flat. Rarity's smile faltered at the unexpected mood.
Are you okay, darling? Don't worry about me, Rarity,
Pinkie said, peering down over the rail with a distant gaze. Strangely, her mane was just as poofy as usual.
We'll get everyone this time.
Rarity wasn't sure what to say to that. Pinkie had, of course, told her of all the ponies that she'd seen during the fall of Fellis Island. All the lives that she had been forced to choose between. She had never brought it up again after they left the sinking ruins, and Rarity had thought it unwise to remind the mayor of such a painful memory. It had been long enough now that Rarity had unthinkingly assumed that Pinkie must have come to terms with that day, but perhaps not. Perhaps Rarity would be the same if she'd had Pinkie's perspective. In a way, she was thankful for her ignorance. It was much easier to feel good about the lives she had saved when she had no way of knowing just how many she had lost. She was pulled out of her reverie by more hoofsteps climbing onto the deck, accompanied by the curious snort of a bear. Her eyes widened as Fluttershy came into sight, followed shortly by Brownie, weighed down with a pair of heavy saddlebags.
Fluttershy?
Rarity blinked.
I would have thought you'd want to stay on the ship. I appreciate it, Rarity,
Fluttershy said, stepping up to the rail. She frowned down at the city below with a quiet, thoughtful confidence.
But I'll be fine.
Rarity cocked her head, examining Fluttershy's expression in silence. This was the new Fluttershy again, she realized. The one that had spent exhausting nights tending to wounded in a siege camp and dodging firebombs and enduring Celestia knew what else. The Fluttershy that made rowdy soldiers quiet down and stand in line with a sideways look. In a way, she seemed more confident now, on the brink of sure danger, than Rarity could ever imagine seeing her. The ship lowered closer, drifting close enough above the floating city that Rarity imagined a properly trained pony might be able to jump down without injuring herself. There wasn't any kind of docking tower in view, and even the tallest of the raft buildings was too short to safely pull up alongside. She swayed slightly as the ship came to a stop over a sort of courtyard, where a wide, open metal raft bobbed between its more built-up neighbors. Rarity was just wondering how they were supposed to get down when one of the marooned air ponies they'd saved approached, a ladder of metal and string on his back. "You're right mad, ma'am," he said, bending down and securing one end of the ladder to the railing with a pair of quick knots. He grunted as he tossed the rest over the edge, the rungs clattering loudly against the hull, and stepped back as if afraid of falling overboard. "These are dead ponies here, every one of them." Rarity arched a brow at that.
So were you, until we saw you.
Aye, and I'm grateful, ma'am. But these ponies are suffering from more than just a broken engine. He shivered before holding out a small knife, hilt to her. "I don't expect I'll see you three again, but take this. Least I can do." Rarity frowned.
I wasn't intending on saving these ponies through bloodshed, darling.
"You misunderstand, ma'am," he said. A nervous smile flickered over his muzzle before vanishing just as fast. "It ain't for the terrors." Rarity cocked her head, confused by the grim tone of the stallion's voice. He held her gaze, unspeaking, and after several seconds she finally understood what he meant. She grimaced, already forming the best way to turn down the macabre gift, when Fluttershy stepped in front of her.
Thank you.
Fluttershy accepted the knife with a soft smile, tucking it into the small bag under her wing.
We appreciate it.
The stallion nodded, apparently relieved, and turned away without bidding goodbye.
Fluttershy, dear.
Rarity started quietly.
Do we really need something like that? I hope not,
Fluttershy said, still keeping that same kind smile.
But it's better to be prepared.
Rarity could find no argument for that, and Pinky was already hauling herself over the railing. Clenching her jaw, she strained to climb down with only her forelegs to support her and her wheels. Fluttershy spread her wings and floated down over the edge, with Brownie snorting and clambering over the railing a moment later. Rarity shook herself, hesitating only a moment before starting down the swaying ladder. The climb felt longer than it was, and with her eyes still adjusting to the dark, it almost felt like descending down a sheer cliff face into an abyss. But then her hooves hit the cold, damp metal, and the ship's engines revved up as it pulled away, taking the ladder and the light with it. And, Rarity realized, the sound. She had spent most of her time in the new Equestria in cities, and the sound of airship engines was a constant in Highton, Fellis, even Friesland. Rarity hadn't realized how used she had gotten to the ever-present droning of engines, until that ship climbed into the night sky, the sound of its propellers fading until it was a barely audible hum, a small bead of light circling through the sky. It was quiet. The waves swelled beneath the metal raft they stood on, rocking it far more than the deck of any airship. The quiet splashing interspersed with irregular knocks and bangs as jetsam bounced about between the city's floating foundations. Rarity's ear twitched at a sudden wet slap, as if something had just jumped in, or out, of the water somewhere nearby, but nothing came of the sound. There were no hoof steps, no chatter. Rarity lit her horn, finding comfort in the soft tinkle of her magic. A new noise scratched at the corner of her hearing, barely perceptible even as it sent a shiver down her spine. With a start, she realized it was coming from beneath her, under the water. A low warbling that grew gradually louder and louder until it crescendoed in a shrill, keening wail. She walked up to the edge of the raft, peering down into the water as the song grew closer. An ethereal golden glow shimmered through the ocean, silhouetting 100 dark, undulating shapes. Some she recognized. Rarity vividly recalled the image of sea ponies dragging refugees away during the collapse of Phallus, and all the others the more chilling in their unfamiliarity. The wailing sounded again, closer this time, as the light shifted, and Rarity gasped at the sight of a brilliant white star shooting beneath them. It twirled and danced through the water as it sang, before diving deeper with a last mournful croon. The dark shape seemed to quicken in its wake, twisting in the water, and 100 tiny circles of shimmering light twinkled into being, reflecting the starlight back at her. For a moment, Rarity was enthralled by their beauty. Then, with a gasp, she realized that the ocean was staring back at her. She opened her muzzle to shout a warning, but all that came out was a startled squeak. The shadows grew, their glowing eyes holding her in their unflinching gaze.
Rarity!
Pinky pulled her back just as the first creature burst forth from the water with a shrill screech. Rarity caught only a glimpse of glowing eyes as she fell on her back with a shriek of her own, adrenaline flooding her veins and bringing her senses into stark detail. She felt the sudden weight landing heavily upon the edge of the raft, tilting the wood beneath her with a nauseating lurch. She heard the screech piercing her ears, furious and hungry, and she rolled onto her belly and was hefted to her hooves by Fluttershy and Brownie. A thin gust of wind parted her mane, but she didn't look back to see the claws slicing through the air behind her. A single second of panic stretched out into forever. She acted on instinct, following Pinky up a ramp of taut netting with thin metal sheets tied to it like a makeshift floor and onto the open deck of a long ship. She could barely hear Fluttershy repeating,
"Oh my goodness,"
behind her over the rush of blood in her ears and the scraping of claws on metal. Could barely think past the panic. There were uncounted predators swimming under her hooves, and she was their prey. The ship lurched to one side as a snarling silhouette clambered onto the deck between her and Pinky. Rarity just barely registered flashing teeth before Brownie rushed past her, shouldering the beast aside with a ferocious roar, and then it was behind her. She caught a glimpse of Pinky's tail disappearing over the edge of the ship and followed without thinking, landing on the deck of another, wider vessel with a heavy grunt. They ran across the breadth of the deck and down a narrow tin ramp that rattled loudly underhoof, Rarity crying out when the water parted beneath her and she felt the wind of jaws snapping shut next to her leg.
"Don't stop!"
Pinky called back, her wheels skidding behind her as she reached the end of the ramp.
"Almost there!"
A makeshift road of scrap metal bucked before them, built on a meandering line of floating barrels that weaved between the ships and rafts. Pinky clattered effortlessly across it, even as more and more snarling shapes burst from the water, sending out frothy waves that made the path jerk and kick like a living animal. Rarity had no choice but to follow. She grit her teeth and thanked Celestia she had decided against an elaborate dress or shoes, digging her hooves in for purchase against the slippery path before kicking off. The howling of the monster spurred her on, following Pinky towards a dark, rigid shape at the end of the path.
"Rarity!"
Pinky glanced back, the focused frown on her face just visible past the salty water splashing between them.
"What? Jump now!"
Rarity jumped. Two sets of snapping jaws reared out of the water on either side, and a pair of monstrous fish slapped down onto the metal just beneath her, briefly dragging it down into the water with their weight before sliding off. She slammed back against the wet metal with a choking gasp, struggling to keep her balance. She risked a glance back and saw Brownie lumbering along behind her, breath chuffing and jaws open to expose his deadly teeth as Fluttershy clung tight to his back. And behind them, a writhing mass of pale flesh and bloody fangs, and wide eyes reflecting the starlight like tiny moonbeams.
Ah! Pinky!
Rarity called hoarsely.
Where are we going? Just in here!
Ahead of them, the path split off and parted around a ship that dwarfed its neighbors, its hull scuffed and battered and broken in places with gaping wounds. Rarity didn't see any way to get aboard. The hull rose up sharply out of the water, curving out over the path in a way that would be impossible to climb, and she saw no netting or ladders. She was just opening her mouth to ask how they'd board when the front of the ship opened up with a sharp thud, a heavy ramp crashing down before them. "Come on!" A stallion beckoned urgently from within, reared up with two hooves wrapped tight around a winch beside him. "Quick!" Pinky was already galloping up the ramp, and Rarity followed without hesitation. She collapsed to the side with a shuddering gasp, looking back to see Brownie leap up the ramp in 2 bounds with Fluttershy on his back. The monsters behind them let loose a blood-curdling howl, showing no signs of slowing. There was a shout from somewhere above, and Rarity saw the netting lying limp over the ramp just before it was pulled taut with a sharp twang. The beasts raising up the ramp were hauled bodily into the air with snarls of outrage. At the same time, the stallion attending the winch threw himself forward, pulling the ramp up via chains running along the ceiling. A pair of steel-eyed mares rushed forward with harpoons, stabbing at those monsters that tried to tear through the net. For a brief moment, Rarity finally got a good look at the creatures that had chased her through the town. Some looked like ponies, and others like huge fish, but each of them was twisted in form, their limbs ending with spearing claws, and their mouths filled with oversized fangs. Then there was another shout, and the trio of flickering lights fell upon the netting from above. They hit the mass of screeching flesh with the sound of shattering glass. And all at once, the netting burst into flames. Rarity flinched back from the wave of hot air, raising a hoof to protect her eyes from the sudden light. The monster's screeching reached a pained crescendo as the ramp drew shut with a ponderous thud. And after several seconds of frantic scraping and beating against the hull, the creatures finally fell silent.